Oh, what a shame. I've now lost the ability to see the participants. Or
I can keep you updated, Lucy. So I've got 33 so far.
oh, fantastic. Welcome, everybody. It's just a question of how long to wait. Usually it's nice to look at the rising participant numbers and see how fast they're rising in terms of deciding when to start. Should we just give it 2 or 3 minutes?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay. Welcome, everyone. We'll start in just a couple of minutes. What do you think? Shall I start?
Yeah, I think so. We're on 44, 45.
Excellent. Okay. Welcome, everyone, to the 4th Global Photographies Network talk of the academic year. My name is Lucy Soutter, and I'm one of the members of the network and the course leader of the Photography Arts MA at the University of Westminster. I'll start today by telling you just a little bit about the network and then introduce you to today's speakers and discussion. So I'll be speaking probably just for 3 or 4 minutes. In June 2020, a group of UK-based photography educators started thinking about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on our students' learning, alongside our desire for a more global discussion around contemporary photography, photography ideas, values, histories, and education. Too often, the global discussion around contemporary photography builds on a model of Western discourse around photography, with works from underrepresented photography cultures given exposure only to the degree that they conform to it. We wanted to help change that. In response to these discussions, the Global Photographies Network was founded by Sarah Pickering at the Slade School of Fine Art, UCL, and Duncan Wooldridge from Camberwell School of Art and Design, which is part of the University of the Arts, London. Founding partners of the network are Mandy Lee Chandrell at Falmouth University, Adrian Davies at Leeds Art University, and myself. As we'd hoped, our network has expanded to include universities and arts organizations in many countries, including Michaelis School of Art at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, Gothenburg University, HDK Varland in Sweden, Universidad de Palermo in Argentina, and organizations in Mexico, Taiwan, and Indonesia. So our audience today comes from several different continents. Our ambition as the network expands is to create a horizontal model of collaboration and a platform for artists, photographers, writers, and curators to present their work and share discussion and dialogue. We're very pleased to welcome you today. Today's event emerged out of my own longstanding interest in the challenges of discussing photography across the boundaries of languages and cultures. Oops, oh, there was my Global Photographies Network slide. Much of the contemporary art world would like us to believe that we've achieved a kind of international shared fluency in our understanding of art and photography concepts. This problematic assumption, rooted in a colonialist attitude, flattens out all sorts of important differences and gaps in the ways photographs and ideas are made and received in their local contexts. Just because photographs and photographic texts travel does not mean that their meaning is the same in different cultural contexts. As one crude illustration, the concentration of art fairs in the western end of the Northern Hemisphere reflects the economic dominance and institutional power of some parts of the art and photography world in relation to others. So how can we discuss the similarities and differences in our understanding of photographic images and ideas when we're using different words, concepts, and traditions to speak and write about them? Translation is a powerful act that offers a great deal of agency to the translator to reshape the meaning of the text. Should the translator offer the most faithful word-for-word equivalent they can of the original text? Or should the translator emphasize the use to which the text will be put, mediating and interpreting as needed to make the text more valuable to its target audience in the new language? And how should that value be understood? What about when the terms of the source text do not exist in the target language, and the translator has to find new combinations of words or characters to convey the ideas? I had these questions in mind when I learned that Yuxin Jiang was translating David Bate's book, Photography, the Key Concepts, for publication in mainland China. Yuxin had recently completed the MA in photographic studies with David Bate at Westminster and had immersed herself in Western photographic theory. I was intrigued to learn more about her experience translating and about David Bate's experience of having his book translated into Chinese as well as into many other languages. So here we are today. Now I will introduce our speakers. Yuxin Jiang is an artist based in London and Shanghai. Her work currently centers on the intersectional identity issues of being a Chinese and a migrant in the UK. She does this by making visible how these issues are embedded in languages, popular culture, and day-to-day life. Yuxin is a lecturer on the BA Photography at the London College of Communication at the University of the Arts London, and is the translator of Photography, the Key Concepts. She's also co-founder of PIC London, a platform that supports artists working in photography and media arts. Professor David Bate is an artist, theorist, and teacher based in London in the UK. David is widely known for his extensive international publications of critical writings on the history and theory of photography and experimental visual artworks. His work focuses on the critical interactions between the visual image, subjectivity, and society. Currently professor of photography at the University of Westminster in London, Bate is also co-founder of the London collective art gallery Accident and 5 Years and co-editor of the photography journal Photographies. So before I pass over to David, just a few things about the webinar generally. If you would like to ask a question at any point in the webinar, could you please type it into the Q&A, the question and answer panel that you'll find at the bottom. We'll select questions to answer in the final 15 minutes at the end of our talk in about 45 minutes. And this talk is currently being recorded, as will all the talks in this series, and they will be available via your network organization and with the agreement of the speakers. So thank you very much. And with that, I will stop sharing and pass on to David. Oops.
Great, thank you, Lucy. Let me just share my screen. Oh, no, disappeared now. Where did that go? Excuse me. I've got a lot of screens open. Where's the translation? Okay, so now you can see my screen. Now I'm going to share my translation. Can you see all of that? I hope so. Should make some sort of sense. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Lucy. And everybody.
Hang on, David. I'm
Hello?
still seeing your email from Sarah Pickering.
Oh. You're sharing screen. So if I click that, it's not showing. Can you?
We don't see your slides. We see your email.
Oh, how weird. So I'll stop the share. Let me try again. This all worked totally fine a few minutes ago. It should be this one. Okay, is that working?
That's it, perfect.
Thank you, sorry. So yeah, it's the same slide. The occasion of this is really to talk about translation, and I just wanted to, in a way, set up a scene for Yuxin to talk in more depth about the particular issues of translation between English and Chinese. So I'm here as a sort of slightly naive author who wrote these books, but not totally naive, because this book and the second edition, which is the one that Yuxin has been translating, was written really as an introductory textbook to photography students in the English-speaking world, with a sense already of the global. And the last chapter in both books is on the global. But it became very clear when I was doing the research for the books that even the concepts that we use in English have their own kind of translation. So, yeah, I mean, probably most of you will know that the word landscape or landskip came from Dutch language in the 17th century. And in the work on the chapter on, say, snapshots, you soon discover that the word snapshot doesn't have an equivalent in some other languages. So in French, there's no immediate obvious translation for snapshot. French is the language I am familiar with. And then in the chapter on photography theory, which deals with semiotics, it's already clear that when you start to speak verbally about a photograph in your own language, that the linguistic term that you use verbally or in written is often very, very different. And I use the word dog, for example, as an example, and I give examples of it in Japanese and German and so forth to make the point. So I think the issue of language, which is central here, is already in a way fundamental to the question of photography, and it's so interesting to think about this in relation to pictures. So the first edition, this book came out in 2009. It was then translated into Japanese. And this is just a very quick anecdote to let you know how it kind of works, is that a Japanese scholar was in London one summer. He came to the photographer's gallery. He bought the book in English, and on the plane read it on the way back and decided to translate it. He's a translator of many texts in mostly film theory. And he liked the book, so he translated it. He found a publisher in Japan, probably my favorite copy of the book that looks like a Barbara Kruger artwork. And he translated it and was published in Japanese. And when I got my copy, you can see, of course, that it starts at the back. So the front, of course, is the back, because in Japan and also in China, you read books from the right to the left, not from left to right. And that got me thinking straight away, what about photo books? Are these also translated in a sense? In other words, that the pictures will all have to be reversed for the Western market. So immediately when I got my own book back, it made me think about the wider issues of cultural translation of photography in those other ways. Went on, was translated into Italian, Slovenian, Taiwanese, and then Turkish. And the Taiwanese book is kind of interesting here, because you would think that Taiwan is the same language as in mainland China, which is what I thought until one of our PhD students said, no, the script in Taiwan is like very old Chinese script before the Cultural Revolution, that during the Cultural Revolution, the party simplified language so that the literate peasants could all read Chinese. So the analogy would be to read a Taiwanese book would be like me trying to read an original Shakespeare manuscript that's written in the old language. I'm sure Yuxin will correct my analogy if that's incorrect. But here too, you can see the book starts at the back. So there's something very sort of simple and complex here about the translation. So this is the book, the second edition of it that Yuxin has been translating into Chinese. And I'm aware that there are at least 2 editions of the same book in Iran, which are, and thanks to the friend who sent me the cover, where they've, which is, if you like, a kind of pirate or bootleg edition that hasn't been hasn't gone through the UK publisher to get permissions. It's just been published. So it's sort of interesting. And they grabbed a picture of me that was made by a photography technician at Westminster somehow off the internet to put it on the cover. So there's this sort of whole sense that it's not only photographs that float around the internet and so forth, but also manuscript texts that I'm sure you and your students are very widely aware that you can get these things online. And then just finally, this book, which came out this year, published with Thames and Hudson, which is a very small book on a selection of greatest hits of exhibitions, photographs and books, was published simultaneously in 5 languages. Yet here too, even though it was sort of governed, if you like, by the London English edition, that Italy and France seem fit to translate the appropriate cover image, which, as we know, is crucial for getting people interested in a book, into very different images. And the Italian one, that's in the book, but the French one, I've no idea where that picture came from. So that also made me think about the way that photographs themselves may or may not translate into different cultures. So there's just simply a set of thoughts here about the issues of translation in photography, which are not restricted to actually translating from language to another. There are much wider ramifications that I feel related to this. But let me now unshare my screen and hand over to Yuxin, who will continue in relation to this book.
Thank you, David. I kind of wanted to carry on listening to you talking about the context of the many editions of your book being translated and how you kind of form different conversations with different translators, but maybe we can save that for another time. I guess to answer that specific point about the Taiwanese edition and how the traditional Chinese characters differentiate from the simplified Chinese characters used in mainland China, is that the grammar, the structure, the sentence, the vocabulary stay the same. The simplifying happens in the sense how you draw these characters. The exact drawings become simplified. And it's interesting that when we try to understand something that happens in a different culture, different context, we often try to say, can we find some sort of equivalence in our mother culture so that we can have a grasp onto what's happening over there? And that's sort of our entry points to understand the differences. But often, as I will be talking about in the translating your book, so more often than not, we can't find that equivalence. We have to really empty ourselves to sort of engage with that total different setup and change, that there's no sort of similar situations that for us to rely on to understand, which I think that is the kind of a challenge all of us are facing when we're trying to understand stuff from a different culture and perspective. So I start sharing my screen as well. Who can share? Sorry,
Green,
clicking the wrong button, looking at the options here.
green
So
button at the bottom.
can you share my, can you see my screen about Cyanotype?
Yep.
Great.
But if you
I can click,
there you go.
play.
That's it. Perfect.
Cool. Right. I want to start by thank you, Lucy, for really devising this discussion, because we've been having corridor conversations about experience of translating from different positions to it. But yeah, it's really kind of interesting that you sort of think we can, you know, form a sort of more formal conversation, and having David together as well for this, and it just felt really interesting, and glad to be part of it. I guess in the popular sense, one of the reasons that photographs are so widely circulated and used as a way of communicating is that they can, in a way, circumvent the language barriers, and that in that sense, they don't really need translating. But when we translate how we understand photography, it becomes a totally different thing. So today what I will do is I'll share a few examples from my experience of translating David's book in Chinese. And hopefully then they can provide some interesting sort of starting points for the wider discussion, which I very much look forward to afterwards. So for me, the most kind of tricky but also interesting part of translating photography isn't about kind of translating the technical terms. Say the word cyanotype here. You can see that there is a direct equivalence of this word in Chinese, and each character literally means kind of blue, exposed under the sun, and method. So it kind of fit neatly when cyanotype is translated into Chinese. So I'm not really kind of thinking that's the most interesting bit of translation, nor is like translating a very specific concept like mise en scène, although when the translation of this word in Chinese and happen, it is about creating a new terminology. And it kind of does sound a bit awkward, the Chinese word. It just doesn't feel quite right or organic. But these are not the most interesting aspects of translating for me. And in other words, not the ones about translating what it is, but the ones about how do we think about it. So for example, the word public in English, which refer to kind of the people as a whole. And here we're spoiled by choices in its Chinese translation. And I have to kind of number them to be able to clearly refer to them in this talk. So for example, the first choice we have, 群众. It has this kind of, it's kind of like a communist term, and it has kind of this connotation of a political category as opposed to you are not the party members, you are the ordinary people. And it's a term that was heavily used in Maoist time, when there's a lot of kind of talking and rhetoric about the policies of and strategies of Communist Party. So there's a strong sense of that associated with the first word, 群众. And for example, number 5 and number 6, number 5, 民众, number 6, 公民, they are closer to the idea of citizens. And number 5, 民众, has more of a sense of democratic undertone to it. And say number 9, 老百姓, which is more of a colloquial term that refers to, say, we, us, the ordinary people. So you can already see how sort of histories and political sort of social context already shape in the Chinese extent, shape the kind of the formation and mutation of words. And when we choose which is the one that best kind of reflect the original writing in English, there's quite a lot to consider and to kind of sift through whether it kind of carries the kind of the closest sort of meaning when translating. Another interesting word, for example, institution. And obviously there's this, its adjectives, institutional, and verb, institutionalize. And in the Western critical thinking framework, it's commonly used as a kind of, in an abstract sense, refer to any organized elements in the society. And when it's translated into Chinese, it can be easily understood as institute. So like as a specific organization, British Film Institute, or Confucius Institute. That's the first word in 机构 institute. And when it does get translated into its abstract sense, the word 体制, that word carries this undertone of communist bureaucracy. But the communist bureaucracy doesn't necessarily mean or has a strong negative sense, not how it's commonly kind of depicted in the West. In the Chinese context, it's closer to a neutral tone with pros and cons. And what's interesting here is also that when I use the word bureaucracy and its Chinese translation, which I've written underneath, which is 官僚, it carries a strong association with feudalism. But when I say feudalism in the West context, what people have in mind is most likely the feudalist systems formed in the European histories. And the Chinese equivalence of the word feudalism, which you can see here, 封建, it cast this shadow of course, the empire formations in the Chinese history. So we can already see like the process of linguistic translation is very slippery, entangled, and messy. It's just as the world itself that languages represent. So far, I talked about a couple of examples, kind of, it's more like direct translating. And I want to move on to talk about a few more kind of examples, which is about kind of abstract concepts or qualities that don't fit neatly when they are carried across from one language to another. In the first chapter of the book, at one point, it's talking about the use of rhetoric in photographic language. And here we have a few lines talking about the origin of rhetoric. And in the last bit, it kind of draws a scope of the main purpose of using rhetoric, which is in the public life. And this kind of carries two senses. On one hand, it's in the kind of based on the Aristotle's writing, is distinction between two spheres of life, the public sphere, which is the political life, and the private sphere, the domestic life. And then on the other hand, of course, this kind of carries over and links to this more of a modern Western society's conception of public versus private. And this awareness of this line between public and private is very much embedded in the social psyche in the West. But both of these pre-existing contexts don't exist in the Chinese culture. The people, in the most common sense, there isn't really a strong kind of conception of a private life. Things between public and private often is very blurred and isn't a dimension of thinking that people would just sort of in their kind of active psyche. But of course, when in the writing, when the scoping of this sense of public life, or in the later discussion in the book where it's talking about personal photography, and of course the public and private would also come into play, the argument about it can sound a bit of kind of out of blue or resonate less strongly in the Chinese culture. Now, this, of course, in the younger generations of Chinese people, this has changed quite a bit. They do have a lot more acute awareness of privacy, but that has largely to do with their internet life and the data collection coming from that, which is a very different kind of development and kind of trajectory of how the concept of private get developed and rooted in the West context.
So, no. I was just going to say that must affect the way people would think about making photographs and how you conceptualize your own practice, right? Because what we might call kind of intimate or private photography, where you might be photographing your own domestic environment, might not be understood in the same way, right?
Yeah, exactly that. And the other example I want to give is about kind of the beauty of one language is really, in a way, quite a shame can be easily lost in the translating. For example, here we have a few lines that's talking about photograph as document and the function of that, and nicely flow to the idea of documentary photography. And it kind of has this nice flow because of the exist of the suffix ARY, so document to documentary. But there's no such a flow because the formation of words just completely different in the Chinese. So when document is translated, the word 文档 is used. And when documentary is translated, it's the word 纪实. They are very different words, and there's no kind of connection as such between them. And the word 文档, which is for document, literally means written materials. And the 纪实, which is for documentary, it means recording the reality. So the word itself does stay kind of truthful in a sense to the English word. But the dynamic you created between document and documentary, in a way for me makes perfect sense, isn't there anymore when it's translated. I'll kind of finish with my sharing with one last example of less about kind of identifying in this case and more about identifying in this case and less about translating. So David actually also mentioned this word dog, and in the book where Sauteurs's kind of semiotics is introduced and talking about languages are signs that don't have inherent meanings, and the word dog is not the same as the concept of dog, because the sign of the concept of dog changes when we use a different language. For example, here, the concept of dog is this writing, this gao, pronounced as in Chinese. and how the framework of semiotics can also apply to photographs as well, in that photographs are signs, and how we understand a photograph is heavily dependent on what does the viewer bring to it, based on their particular knowledge frameworks. And when I was translating this part, you can see I didn't translate dog to the Chinese character go. I kept dog as it is, as dog, because the kind of argument made here, which is quite rooted in the English as a language, it doesn't carry the same sort of kind of universal power when we're speaking or looking at Chinese as a language. A lot of the Chinese characters, they do carry inherent meanings. It's a language that both has semantic and phonetic dimensions. So when we say these three different words in English, dog, cat, fox, the differences between them isn't about the word itself. It's about how they refer to different concepts, different animals. But if you're looking at the Chinese writing, the Chinese word for these three animals, you start to notice they share the same kind of left part of it, which I put on the right hand side. It's kind of one sort of the part of the component of how typically Chinese characters are formed. And this component, which is called radicals, and in this case, it has a name to it called Fanquan. So this particular component, and it is coming from the Asian writing of dog, coming from the drawing of dogs. So when I was translating the part about how language is kind of more hasn't got the inherent meaning as more towards kind of how they sit with each other, I start to feel kind of this distance created between what is being said and what I see from my perspective. Even though I acknowledge the point being made, I don't feel we are quite we in this case. And this kind of leads to the question I want to ask, which is, to what extent do we identify with the we? And when there is a distance, how do we acknowledge it and open it up as a space where different perspectives can come in and speak to each other? I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yuxin. Would you say a little bit more about, because I think that's such an interesting point about how much we, it's quite a common thing in Western texts, certainly English language texts, to refer to we, the sort of idea of a collective, a shared experience of the thing that you're writing about. And I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about how you decided to handle that generally in your translation, if you felt the need to add any sort of side explanations. Did you end up including a glossary or anything? How did you handle that sense of shared experience or history or collective knowledge?
It's interesting because I see this we as almost like the writer is sitting next to the reader and they're trying to talk, facing the same direction and talking with each other. And it's a very useful way to engage with the reader. I I stay kind of saying the we in the Chinese sense in the translation of it, but I think what's interesting is when the we is put in a Chinese word. For example, in this case, when a Chinese reader reads this text, there's very degrees of like how much do I feel I'm part of this collective we. For example, the thing I just talked about, the fox, dog, and cat, they are different in how the language referred to the original concept, the concept. But there's also the other side of the story, which is most Chinese schools start teaching English from year 3. And English is one of the 3 majors just after Chinese and math. So even though when the Chinese reader engage with this part of the text, they feel like, well, my language isn't quite working the same way, but they also has a kind of a bit of entry and relatable kind of relationship to the English discussed, because no matter how much they use English, they have been taught in school, and they probably can understand dog, cat, fox as a word. But if, say, the language is written in Arabic, there's no way to relate anymore. So that also kind of make it interesting as seeing English as this de facto lingua franca thing. And like it or not, it is kind of most widely used, the language in the world, and how, in a sense, it functions as this mirror to reflect in a kind of local positionality in relationship to this globalized context.
It's fascinating that a piece of the symbol or sign for fox, cat, and dog is the same, because there is something that they obviously do have in common as creatures. So it's funny that a bit of the actual sign is identical, and the other, you can sort of see how that makes sense. I think you've made fantastic examples of how, as Lucy had set out, that what role translation has in relation to a text and its culture. I mean, I used to think of this in terms of, say, active or passive translation, that you would somehow, a passive translation would be you try to keep the sense of the original text and just do the best you could to translate it to another language. Or active, where you're actually thinking about who's going to read this and how they understand. So you're actually, this is Jacques Derrida's position on translation, which is that all translation is interpretation, and you just have to accept that. So in fact, it should have your name on the book as author or co-author in a way, because you've done so much work in thinking how photography can or could or should be understood within a broader kind of sense of Chinese culture. So it's not just changing words from one thing to another. It's actually, as you've, I think, really beautifully demonstrated all those problems, how, I mean, even like particularly fascinating the thing about animals in the public. How does one write something that does not translate in a way because it doesn't exist? And of course, it's funny that you pulled out the rhetoric example, because that is, of course, the foundation of democracy. This is where rhetoric is used in a way, arguably, in relation to the founding of public discourse in that European Western world sense of the demos, of people speaking, so forth. So yeah, really fascinating case studies. I do remember when, early on, that we had this conversation about how to translate the Walter Benjamin text quote that everyone quotes. Actually, can I remember it? So the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, which of course I've had many discussions, that's not even arguments, with German scholars about what is the right translation for that to English. And then we were talking about what was the right one, because I'd used one text, which basically I had chosen the translation of Benjamin, which I preferred. And you were raising the question of these other ones, and I felt slightly uncomfortable because I realized how, of course, I'd made an executive decision as an author that this was the best translation. So yeah, she just reminded me of that.
Yeah, it's interesting you sort of remember that, because that was quite a kind of an interesting thing that happened with the convention of translation. If the book already was existed in Chinese language, then I wouldn't create a new version of it. I would just use the quote that's already existed in Chinese. So with someone like Walter Benjamin, it's well established, and of course it's already existing a couple of versions of the little history of photography in Chinese language, and that's I wanted to use. But the problem started when I read that couple of versions of the Chinese translation, and they didn't make sense to me. And they were like, I'm like, what the hell are you talking about? So that led me to, of course, firstly to study closely with English writing of that piece, that few paragraph, that particular paragraph. But then, of course, the origin is in Germany. That let me have a conversation with you, and also speaking to a German friend. Like, can you tell me what's your understanding? That's your mother tongue. How would you say the English translation? How much does it stay true to the original meanings? So there's such kind of multi-layered relationship already existing in that very just a few lines.
Because the English translations were already interpretations to suit the reason that text was being used in English was, to make particular cultural arguments about photography. So there is, you never get to the bottom.
I didn't include that example because it's quite technical if I get into bits and bobs of it. So I thought maybe leave it out for now. But yeah.
One audience question that might be good to insert here, which is, how do you deal with the translation when the word used might have different connotations for the person reading them? For example, calling someone a dog in some cultures can have a very negative connotation that David might not have intended when he selected that as a sort of generic noun, right?
I don't think the writing was imposing or refer any person to a dog. It was just using, looking at the relationship between the language and the signs.
I think
to that specific, I don't think that was an issue. But like I've mentioned, a few words so many words in Chinese, they carry very different meanings, and that's inevitable. And I think the space is more for how do we raise questions and have discussions about, hold on a minute, what do you mean in your context? I feel quite awkward, different, and bizarre when I'm reading this in Chinese. That's when the understanding from both ends or multiple kind of perspectives can come in.
Yeah.
Was the Taiwanese edition useful to you in any way? Because
I had a brief look at the beginning, but I decided not to sort of refer to it when I'm actually in the kind of heat of translating, because I guess even though it's not me creating something new, but everyone has its own kind of flow and style in forming the sentences, and in a sense, I feel slightly disturbed if I kind of keep refer to that language as the kind of the pace and everything is just quite different. So I kind of parked it aside. And when I do have some doubt of certain that technical sort of side of things, how do I kind of translate? I did refer to it as one of the references looking at things. But because the writing of photography in this book is very much part of the vocabulary of Western sort of critical theory. It kind of has a wider references around everything in that kind of scope getting translated, and how words are being used or created in Chinese.
Well, this was a question I had for you. Did you need to what extent did you need to coin new characters for terms that might not have an equivalent that carried the same weight in Chinese? Did you need to create new terms?
I certainly try to avoid it. And I try to use, and I don't think there has been a case like I have to coin a new term, because there has been so much work that's already translated in Chinese in varying qualities, but they do exist. So I prefer to make a choice between the existing vocabularies, and by making that choice, kind of establishing how do I think the most kind of the closest kind of meaning towards original thing, rather than sort of start up a new kind of what's the word, complete a new page, let's say. And also because, for example, the word representation, it has two widely used Chinese versions of it, and one of them is much more heavily used in academia and in kind of visual culture studies, and the other ones is more of a common sense word. But I went with the common sense word because the academia word, it just, for me, it's a bit, for me, kind of academia for the sake of being academic. It doesn't carry the sort of the effectiveness of the more common or laid word. So I was doing more of a choices and really sifting through the differences. And if a word doesn't quite, an existing word doesn't quite carry the English sense, I try to still use that word, but kind of put an emphasis of how this translation is trying to bring or add new meanings to the existing word.
Now we've got a few audience questions here. There's one person who I suspect may be a translation student, because we've got some quite specific questions. So let's run a couple of them by you. The first question is, and you'll have to excuse my pronunciation. Have you found shuo wen ji ji helpful for definition of analyzing characters in modern Chinese word? And I'm sure I butchered that. I have a terrible Chinese accent.
说文解字, it's quite a classic book about the Chinese language. To be honest, I didn't refer to that at all.
That's totally fine. Okay, question number 2. What do you think about putting the original term alongside the translated Chinese word? How do you think about that?
That is quite a common practice, especially in translating Western theories into Chinese. When those particular terms are used, the common practice is to put a bracket after this and have the original word there. So it's kind of easier. There's an index for people to refer to if they ever want to go back or read the original text.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That's common between European languages too, where, I mean, I'm aware of psychoanalysis where concepts, it's not just words, but concepts don't exist in the receiving culture. So like jouissance is doesn't have a translation into English. So they said, we just use the French word because it doesn't have, so there's a space for it because it doesn't have a meaning in the culture. So then it gets taken up.
Yes, and some of them where the gap ends up being continuing to be quite contested, like the French word diapositive, which
Yes.
refers both to the negative and to the apparatus. And French scholars feel that English scholars don't have any useful grip on this term at all. And the third question from the same audience member, and I apologize, I have no idea what this question means. Could you please talk about your thought on the translation from moving image to Yuxin Jiang? Are you able to read these questions yourself? Because
yeah, well, that's the thing about, you know, the not have access to a language kind of creates this opaqueness to that yin shang. That's basically moving image in Chinese.
okay.
I'm not sure where this question coming from. In what sense would you like to know about the thought of translating that? I guess one thing is moving image, literally moving, image just moves, right? And yin shang, in a funny way, I kind of need to write down the Chinese word because it's such a visual language to be able kind of to properly think about it in some way, if that makes sense. The first word "in" kind of means, well, well, reflection or shadow. There's many kind of, maybe I should put this in the chat box so that everyone can see. Is there a chat box? No, there's not a chat box.
So here I have one more question. What we'll probably do is continue for about 10 minutes past the top of the hour, but we do understand that some people will need to go. But I guess the final question I had for you is about how the issues of translating, are the issues of translating, do you think, any different when you're dealing with photography as opposed to anything else as the subject of the language? And I was wondering if there were any particular concerns. I mean, obviously, the fact that you had experience with this medium must have come in handy. But I was just wondering if you had any other thoughts or comments around that.
I suppose a particular thing is when I was thinking about when translating this particular photography book is that when this book is introduced in a Chinese context, what kind of existing understanding of photography that's already there, and how the concepts and topics and dealt with in this book speak to or not speak to what's already there in the Chinese context. And from my understanding, the kind of the wide we understand the most sort of common way of understanding photography in the Chinese context is probably still very much with the whole glory of magnum photographers, war photographers, documentary photographers, and then also the humanist photographers, and also very much the aesthetic is the way to go about approach aesthetic is very much coming from modernism influence. So that's what's there. And when you introduce different sort of other disciplines or frameworks as a way to think about photography, it could feel a bit sort of it's kind of introducing a sort of in a wide, a broad, and kind of way to sort of which already existing ways of thinking is part of it, but very small part of it, and there's not much sort of systematic connection between them. So when I'm translating this book, what I was thinking is it will be useful for the Chinese context to connect what's already in their understanding to a wider context. Why are these things have their significance, and why they are not the only way that carries meanings in photography.
That's really interesting, because one of the other questions is about what the difference might be between translating a photography text to a literature text. And it's to do with you considering the existing body of literature and building on that. I mean, the existing body of photography writing in Chinese and being in dialogue with that. That's really interesting. Okay, one more question from our audience. How much effort did you put into the work to improve the readability when you translated it to Chinese, to make it more localized, smooth, less like translated English? And it sounds like that was one of your complaints about some of the other translated texts that you'd read, that they hadn't done that so much.
Well, to be honest, they were not even that. They were not even about readability. They were just, I guess there's quite a lot of like translating a very literal sense.
Yeah.
Which, for example, the idea of like the institutional use of photography, how military, marriage, all different kind of institutions comes into play, could be just simplified as the different applications or usages of photography. So the whole layer of this abstract understanding of institution just get lost, and I think there's a lot of that going on. And I do try my best for the Chinese translation to be as readable as possible. I think I went through my translation 5 times, each time focus on a different aspect of this but this for language writing. And the last one, well, from like checking those technical terms and academic words, am I really, making the right choices, to the last time just forget about leave the original text aside and really just reading the Chinese and see how it feels in this language.
Another audience question is whether you discussed your translation with Chinese colleagues who speak English, whether you showed it to any of them.
I don't really have very close colleagues who's also Chinese. Well, I did have discussions with a few peers who works and lives in China, but not in the West context. Yeah.
And do you think that makes a big difference in terms of doing this translation? Because lots of Chinese translators of Western texts haven't necessarily spent much time in the West. Do you think it was helpful to your translation that you had?
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, if I would not did not study with David or exposed to the Western thinking framework, I wouldn't have a grasp of many words used and beyond their literal sense. So that is totally helpful. And yeah, I mean, over the years, that's of course is really valuable, but also I'm starting to think, how those perspectives I was talking about, how can they also emerge, come to the surface and join in the conversations?
Yes. So then another question, are you familiar with the translation of Chinese theoretical texts into English? And if so, are there any shifts in dynamics or prominent differences when translating in that direction that you've noticed?
In what context do you, what kind of theory does it refer to? Does it refer to a particular sort of field of study?
It doesn't mention maybe photography?
Don't know. I'm not too sure because I've been sort of living and really breathing the air in the UK for the past few years. And although I'd love to get more connected to the Chinese, like, I mean, I do had a look at a lot of visual culture theories written in Chinese, but I didn't have a look. I didn't look at the English translation of them, or if ever being translated to English.
I wonder if it's very different because in a way, I mean, I'm aware really of reading quite recently a lot of text by a Korean philosopher but he turns out he's teaching and living in Germany. So if you are a philosopher working with a Western context, there's a very well established field, right? So in a way, it already has a kind of sophisticated language for itself. What you seem to be implicitly saying, but correct me if I'm wrong, is that because photography clearly has an established existence in China, but it doesn't have, from what you're saying, a clearly established kind of critical discourse around it in anything like the same way that it could or does here. So therefore, it's about building a vocabulary of concepts and ideas in which that can exist in a way. I mean, it took 100 years for the UK to develop any kind of critical framework in photography, it seems to me. So it's not surprising if, even though photography's been around for very long, that's not to say, there's a kind of cultural inferiority or superiority. It's about how particular cultures develop particular ideas and arguments in different ways. So it's not, that's not in any way prejudicial to say that there isn't a discourse on something, because in a way, this culture in Britain, there are certain ways we are not able to talk about things that I'm sure you can in China. For example, health. I'm sure that there's a language there that is very different from the either hardcore science medicine here or kind of natural hippie herbalists. And there's something else. I know, even in France, you have a very different, in European cultures, you have different attitudes to those things. So I wonder if it's very different in a sense, if you're moving to a discipline where it's heavily established what the kind of concepts and terms are, where you can make kind of radical moves probably because you don't feel burdened by them in the same way. But nevertheless, there's a language that you can enter into.
I think one of the things that I encountered when I went to China and attended a conference about sort of translation and photography was the idea that since most of the writings about photography, either in Chinese or in translation, had appeared in China since the late 1980s, that there was a fascinating kind of simultaneity of the theories. So whereas our theories, as you say, have rolled out consecutively over more than a century, so that we think of them as being rooted in the moment that they emerged, whether it's an idea from the 1890s or an idea from the 1970s. Whereas one of the things I heard people talking about in China was the fact that a lot of these different theories might seem equally available because they had all become available in the same very compressed period of time, which I thought was quite liberating in a way, sort of freeing from the pressure of institutions and histories and traditions and hierarchies. And it was just like, here, take what you want. One more audience question that I think, sorry, that may beg for a, but one other question to try and squeeze in before we end, that I think is quite important, is about self-censorship, Yuxin, and how you think about it when you're translating content that might potentially be sensitive, because I think that that may be of concern to quite a lot of people.
I mean, in the case of this book, maybe there's only one case I thought about, oh, whether this is a bit sensitive. So it generally has been okay with this book. But I guess my approach with censorship and self-censorship is kind of being strategic about it. In the sense that the way how our speech is managed in mainland China, the extent of it, the management of that is kind of beyond the fight from individuals. There's no way you can fight against it. So it's this, it's just not me. There's so many grassroots strategies people have been using of kind of, circumvent the kind of the censorship mechanism, and then this kind of constant sort of battle between what's being said and what's being censored, and the kinds of level up between the games of, say, a certain way of talking about, say, for a while, people referred to Xi Jinping as Winnie the Pooh. So they kind of escaped censorship by using a little cartoon image. But then that got noticed and got sort of blocked, or the Winnie the Pooh. And then people invent new way of talking about things. So that's more about, how do you find ways of carry on regardless of the situation?
So I won't be arrested when I go to China for your translation. Good to hear. You're muted, Lucy.
Sorry. I'm very happy. Do either of you have any final thoughts you wanted to share? There are a few other questions that I'm terribly sorry we weren't able to get to everything, but I think we're just about out of time. Well, yes, this was everything I hoped for, and I hope that the discussion will continue. Thank you everyone for joining us, and I believe in January we're going to have Zhuang Wu Bin speaking about his work on photography in Southeast Asia, which I think will be a very productive follow-on from this discussion. So do keep your eyes open for—
In February, just a heads up.
Oh, in February, sorry, excuse me.
Yeah,
February. Do you have the date, Reshi?
Yeah, I should do. Let's have a look. So Wednesday, the 16th of February.
Excellent.
2022.
So keep your eyes peeled for that. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you again another time. Thank you to our speakers.
Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
And David and Yuxin, do you have a look